Jackie didn't ask why the stranger was standing on the porch of her quiet bakery at closing time. His broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as the evening fog rolled in. She simply unlocked the screen door, stepped aside, and handed him a warm, fresh cup of coffee. Kong Tae-oh, a man who had spent his entire life ruling a high-stakes family empire, looked down at the simple ceramic mug in his trembling hands, his usual proud stance completely gone. He had been betrayed and left bankrupt by the people he trusted most. But looking into Jackie's calm, kind eyes, he realized he hadn't just found a hiding place, he had stumbled into the first piece of real peace he had ever known. Welcome to Annie's Empire of Love, your cozy sanctuary for the most beautiful, slow-burn BWKM romance audiobooks. We are dedicated to bringing you genuine love, emotional healing, and pure romantic butterflies with brand new stories posted every day at 3 p.m. PST, 6 p.m. EST. Thank you for being part of our growing family. Today, we are stepping into a story that will challenge everything you know about secrets, survival, and a cold mafia king who meets his match. Before we dive into this emotional roller coaster, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and leave a thumbs up on this video. Now, let's find out what happens when the underworld collides with an innocent heart. The quiet evening hum of the neighborhood was fading as Jackie wiped down the smooth wooden counters of her bakery. The smell of sweet vanilla and warm cinnamon still hung heavy in the air, a comforting shield against the chilly fog creeping across the pavement outside. It was past closing time, and the world was settling into a peaceful silence. Jackie reached up to unfasten her linen apron when she noticed a long shadow stretching across the front glass door. Standing on the porch was a man she had never seen before. Even with his shoulders slumped in a state of absolute defeat, his towering frame was undeniable. It was Kong Tae-oh. Just 3 hours earlier, his name was spoken in whispers across executive boardrooms and high-stakes shipping docks. Now, he stood beneath the dim porch light, with nothing but a single, worn leather suitcase at his side. His expensive tailored wool coat was damp from the mist, and his hands were tucked deeply into his pockets, trembling slightly. Not from the cold, but from the crushing shock of being completely betrayed by his own flesh and blood. Jackie froze for a second, her gaze locking onto his face. His sharp, aristocratic features were completely pale, and his dark eyes looked entirely hollow, staring at the floor as if he couldn't quite believe he was standing on a normal city street. He looked like a man who had been running for hours with nowhere left to go. Instead of panicking or locking the door, Jackie let out a soft, steady breath. She could read people well, and she didn't see a threat, she saw a human being who was completely spent. She walked over, unlocked the latch, and pushed the screen door open. The cool night air rushed in, but Jackie's voice was warm. "We're closed," she said softly, her tone gentle and grounding. "But the fog is thick tonight. Come inside out of the damp." Tae-oh lifted his head slowly, blinking as if waking from a nightmare. He didn't move at first, unused to a voice that held no hidden demands or underlying malice. He looked at Jackie, her rich melanin skin looking soft under the bakery's warm amber lights, her expression completely calm and devoid of judgment. With a slow, heavy nod, he stepped over the threshold. Jackie quietly closed and locked the door behind him, turning the world off outside. She didn't press him for his name, and she didn't ask why a man in a bespoke suit looked like a ghost. She simply reached into the back cloakroom, retrieved a thick, soft knitted blanket, and stepped toward him. "Let me take your coat," she murmured. Tae-oh let her slide the heavy damp wool from his broad shoulders. He felt strangely naked without his armor, but as Jackie draped the warm, dry blanket over his back, a sudden wave of comfort hit him. She guided him gently by the elbow toward a small, plush booth nestled right next to the clinking radiator. "Sit down," she said. "Give yourself a moment to breathe." Tae-oh sank into the booth, his legs suddenly feeling like lead. He pulled the blanket tightly around himself, staring at the grain of the wooden table. For a billionaire king who was used to command structures and corporate warfare, the sheer simplicity of this moment was overwhelming. Jackie walked into the back kitchen, leaving him in the soothing quiet. Within 15 minutes, she returned, placing a steaming ceramic bowl of slow-simmered beef soup and a thick slice of freshly baked crusty bread in front of him. Beside it, she set down a mug of hot honey ginger tea. "Eat," Jackie said quietly, sitting across from him in the booth, keeping her distance so he wouldn't feel crowded. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Teo stared down at the steam rising from the bowl. In his world, a meal served by an outsider was a liability. It was a weapon, a trap, or a transaction. But as he looked up and met Jackie's steady, kind eyes, he knew there was no trap here. He picked up the heavy spoon with a trembling hand and took a slow, quiet bite. The rich, savory warmth immediately spread through him, grounding his racing mind and soothing the hollow ache in his chest. A sudden, thick knot formed in his throat, and he had to look down to hide the raw emotion in his face. He didn't say a single word, but as he ate in reverent silence, the heavy walls around his heart began their very first, fragile crack. The next few days passed in a gentle, unhurried rhythm that Teo was entirely unfamiliar with. Jackie had quietly offered him the small, modest spare room at the back of the bakery, a peaceful space that smelled faintly of dried lavender and old books. When he woke up on his second morning, he found his damp, ruined suit folded neatly away. In its place at the end of the bed was a stack of clean, simple clothes, a pair of soft cotton lounge pants, and a plain, oversized gray pullover that Jackie mentioned belonged to her older brother. Stripping off the expensive fabrics of his old life, Teo pulled the thick fleece over his head. For the first time in over a decade, he wasn't wearing the heavy physical armor of an executive king. He was just a man. Rather than hiding in the room, Teo found himself drawn to the warmth of the kitchen. He spent his mornings sitting quietly on a wooden stool near the back counter, out of sight from the front street windows, simply watching her work. In his previous world, every waking second was consumed by threat assessments, corporate sabotage, and watching his back. His mind was a perpetual chessboard. But here, the world was remarkably still. He watched the steady, practiced movement of Jackie's hands as she kneaded dough on the floured wooden block. He listened to the low, soulful R&B humming from the vintage radio on the shelf. He paid attention to how she managed the front of the shop. She didn't use the fake, calculated smiles of the corporate executives he was used to. She greeted her morning regulars with genuine, effortless warmth, remembering their names, their children, and their favorite pastries. She handled her life with a calm clarity that fascinated him. Slowly, the exhausting, hyper-vigilant noise in Teo's mind began to quiet down. He didn't have a treacherous family to fight. He didn't have orders to issue or bodyguards to manage. The crushing weight of his lost empire felt miles away when he was sitting in this small, fragrant kitchen. Late one morning, as the breakfast rush finally faded, Jackie wiped her hands on a clean towel, poured herself a small cup of tea, and leaned against the counter opposite his stool. She didn't ask if he was ready to leave, and she didn't pry into the massive fortune he had lost. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting a deep, patient understanding, and offered a soft, quiet smile. A smile that expected absolutely nothing from him in return. Teo felt the lingering tension physically leave his shoulders. He rested his arms on the counter, the tight grip he had kept on his own sanity finally loosening. He didn't say a word, but as he returned her smile with a faint, tentative one of his own, a deep, unspoken bond settled into the space between them. It wasn't built on grand promises or dramatic rescues. It was built entirely on the profound, quiet peace she had freely given him. By the end of his first week, the bakery felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Late one evening, the shop was completely still. The large commercial ovens had been turned off and were slowly cooling down, filling the back room with a lingering, comforting warmth. Outside, a light drizzle tapped against the darkened windows, but inside, a single small lamp cast a soft glow over the kitchen table. Teo sat alone in the quiet, staring down at his coffee mug. The peacefulness of the day had faded, leaving him alone with the harsh reality of his situation. Jackie finished wiping down the final prep station. She folded her apron over a chair and quietly walked over, pulling up a seat directly across the small wooden table from him. She didn't bring a distraction, and she didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She simply sat with him, offering her steady presence. After a long moment, she rested her arms on the table. "You've been carrying a heavy load all week, Teo," she said softly. "What happened?" Teo closed his eyes. The question didn't feel intrusive or demanding. It felt like an invitation to finally set a crushing weight down on the table. When he opened his eyes, he didn't look away. He looked directly at her. "They took everything," he said, his voice low and raw, stripped of its usual executive polish. "My uncles, the corporate board I spent the last 10 years building, they turned on me. They falsified the legal trusts, froze my private accounts, and pushed me out entirely. I was forced to walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back." He looked down at his empty hands that used to control international shipping lanes with a single signature. "I spent my entire life protecting that family, and in one afternoon, they erased me. I am completely bankrupt. The name Kong Teo has no value anymore." He left himself completely exposed, expecting the shift he had seen in people 100 times before. The moment a powerful man loses his wealth, the people around him usually walk away. Jackie didn't walk away. She didn't show pity, and she didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she reached across the table, placing her warm hand firmly over his. It was a simple, grounding touch, but to a man who had been isolated by power and paranoia for his entire adult life, it carried the weight of the world. "They took your capital, Teo," Jackie said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "They didn't take your brilliant mind, and they didn't take your character. A bank account doesn't dictate your worth." She gently squeezed his fingers, her dark eyes holding his gaze steady. "And more importantly, you aren't carrying this alone anymore." Teo stopped breathing for a second. The absolute sincerity in her tone completely dismantled the very last of his defensive walls. Slowly, he turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers, holding on to her warmth like a lifeline. In the quiet dimness of the bakery, the crushing, suffocating weight of his isolation finally dissolved, leaving behind a profound sense of relief. Over the next few days, the cramped, flour-dusted office at the back of the bakery transformed into their shared workspace. Teo had spent his entire life operating at the top of a massive corporate ladder, surrounded by yes-men and executives. But sitting across the small wooden desk from Jackie, he discovered what a true partnership actually felt like. He wanted to rebuild, but his mind was still stuck on high-level, billion-dollar logistics. He would map out complex shipping routes on a yellow legal pad, frustrated by his lack of capital to make them happen. That was when Jackie stepped in. She pulled up a chair next to him, gently sliding his notes to the center of the desk. Using her years of experience running a small business and her deep understanding of the local community, she showed him a different path. She pointed out gaps in the regional supply chains, local vendors, and independent transport drivers who needed a brilliant coordinator to manage their routes. She didn't just offer encouragement, she offered him a practical, grounded strategy to start a completely legal logistics consulting firm from scratch. "You don't need a fleet of ships right now, Teo," she explained late one night, tapping the end of her pen against the paper. "You just need to be the bridge between the people who have the goods and the people who have the trucks. You know the routes better than anyone. Start there." Teo looked from the paper to her face. He was struck not just by her kindness, but by her sharp, practical intelligence. A genuine, relaxed smile broke across his face, the first real smile he had worn in weeks. "You are completely right," he murmured, picking up his pen with a renewed sense of purpose. They fell into an easy, natural rhythm. The heavy, formal distance of his past life vanished entirely. They spent hours shoulder to shoulder under the warm glow of the desk lamp, sorting through local market data and drafting business models. They shared quiet jokes over reheated coffee, their voices kept low so they wouldn't disturb the quiet of the sleeping neighborhood. One night, the clock on the wall ticked quietly past 2 in the morning. Teo looked up from his notes to ask her a question about a local distributor, only to find that Jackie had finally lost the battle against her exhaustion. She was resting her head on her folded arms across the desk, her breathing slow and steady, fast asleep. Tae-oh set his pen down. He didn't wake her. Instead, he stood up quietly, walked over to the armchair, and picked up the soft knitted shawl she kept there. He carefully draped it over her shoulders, making sure she was warm. He lingered for a moment, looking down at her peaceful face in the dim light. The gratitude in his chest was shifting into something much deeper and far more permanent. As he gently brushed a loose braid away from her cheek, he realized he wasn't just rebuilding a business. He was falling completely in love with the woman who was helping him build it. The fragile piece they had built was abruptly tested later that week. The morning rush at the bakery had just ended, and Jackie was wiping down the front counter, while Tae-oh sat in the corner booth, reviewing a draft of their first local consulting contract. The bell above the bakery door chimed loudly, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. A man in a sharp, expensive suit walked in, followed closely by another man who looked like hired muscle. Taeo's hand tightened around his coffee mug. It was Park Ji-soo, a mid-level associate from his former syndicate, a man who had eagerly sided with Taeo's betrayers to secure his own promotion. Ji-soo stopped in the center of the shop, looking around at the simple wooden chairs and the display case of pastries with an exaggerated expression of amusement. His eyes finally landed on Tae-oh, who was wearing his oversized gray fleece. "Well," Ji-soo said, his voice loud and mocking in the quiet space. "Look at the great Kong Tae-oh. From the top floor of the corporate tower to sitting in a neighborhood bakery. I heard you were bankrupt, but seeing you reduced to this, it's almost sad." Tae-oh placed his mug deliberately on the table, his jaw clenched, the old commanding authority rising in his chest. But before he could even push his chair back to stand up, Jackie moved. She stepped out from behind the counter, walking smoothly to the center of the floor. She didn't look intimidated by the expensive suits or the muscle standing by the door. She stood firmly between Ji-soo and the corner booth, her posture calm, professional, and entirely unbothered. "Excuse me," Jackie said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through Ji-soo's arrogance. "This is a private business, and you are currently disrupting my customers." Ji-soo scoffed, looking her up and down. "I'm just catching up with an old colleague. Why don't you go back to baking bread?" Jackie didn't raise her voice, but her eyes hardened with a fierce, absolute dignity. "Actually, what you are doing is trespassing and targeted harassment," she said calmly, crossing her arms. "And since you walked through that door, your face, your associate's face, and the license plate of the vehicle you parked out front have all been recorded on my commercial security system. A system that automatically logs directly to the local precinct if I press the silent alarm behind my counter." She tilted her head slightly, her tone dropping into something razor-sharp. "So, unless you want your new bosses to explain to the authorities why their executives are harassing private citizens in a different district, I suggest you leave my shop right now." Jisoo's smirk vanished completely. He stared at Jackie, completely caught off guard by her intelligence and her refusal to be bullied. He looked at the small security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, then back at her unwavering stance. Realizing he was entirely outmatched by her calm authority, he gave Tae-oh one last sour look, turned on his heel, and walked out, his muscle following closely behind him. The heavy door swung shut, and the quiet returned to the bakery. Jackie let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing as she turned to face the corner booth. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Tae-oh was staring at her, completely motionless. In his world, loyalty was bought with money and enforced by fear. No one had ever stood in front of him simply to protect his peace. He looked at this incredible woman who had just stared down corporate enforcers without a second thought to defend a man who had nothing left to give her, and felt a profound, overwhelming shift in his chest. "I'm fine," he finally said, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely contain. His dark eyes locked onto hers, burning with intense, genuine admiration. In that exact moment, watching her stand as his shield, he realized he didn't just love her. He completely adored her. The adrenaline from the afternoon's confrontation had long since faded, leaving behind a heavy, Quiet stillness in the bakery's back apartment. The only sound was the soft hum of the small space heater in the corner and the occasional patter of late-night rain against the window pane. Teo sat on the edge of the small sofa, staring at the floor. Jackie's fierce defense of him earlier that day had moved him in a way he was still struggling to process. In his world, people only stayed when it was profitable. But Jackie had stood her ground simply because she believed he was worth protecting. Because of that, he felt a sudden, overwhelming need for her to see exactly who she was protecting. He didn't want any shadows between them anymore. Jackie walked into the room, carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. She set them on the low coffee table and sat down next to him, leaving a comfortable space between them. Teo took a slow, steadying breath. Without saying a word, he reached up and began to unfasten the top buttons of his Henley shirt. He pulled the soft fabric aside, exposing his left shoulder and collarbone. Running across the thick muscle of his shoulder was a jagged, faded scar. It wasn't clean or surgical, it was a rough, permanent reminder of a violent life. "I got this when I was 22, Teo said, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to look at her face, afraid of the revulsion he might see there. "It was my first year taking over the family operations. An associate I thought was a mentor decided I was too young to lead. It was a lesson in betrayal." He pulled the shirt a little tighter, a sudden wave of shame washing over him. "I know who I am now, Jackie, but this is what I come from. It's a mark from a cold, unforgiving world. I wanted you to see it. I needed you to know the kind of history you stood up for today." Jackie didn't gasp, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted closer on the sofa. She reached out, her hand moving with a slow, deliberate gentleness. When her fingertips made contact with his skin, Teo's breath hitched, but he forced himself to stay still. Jackie traced the uneven line of the scar. Her touch was incredibly light, carrying no judgment, no fear, and no pity. It was just warm, steady acceptance. "It doesn't look like a cold world to me, Teo," she said softly. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were completely clear, filled with a deep, quiet affection. "It just looks like history," Jackie continued, her hand resting warmly against his shoulder. "It shows how hard you had to fight just to survive. It tells me what you lived through, but it absolutely does not define the good, honorable man sitting in my home right now." Teo closed his eyes, the absolute sincerity of her words breaking through the final, lingering walls around his soul. For decades, he had carried his past as a burden, assuming it made him unworthy of normal, unconditional love. But sitting here, feeling the gentle weight of her hand on his skin, he felt entirely washed clean. He leaned his forehead against hers, letting out a long, shaky breath, finally feeling completely seen, entirely safe, and truly loved. 2 weeks of late nights, endless cups of coffee, and meticulous planning culminated on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The bakery was closed for the day, and the afternoon sun was casting long, golden beams across the wooden floors. Jackie was organizing a stack of invoices at the small office desk, while Teo sat beside her, staring intently at his laptop screen. They had submitted their final logistics proposal to a major independent regional distributor a few days prior. It was a massive network, one large enough to officially launch their new consulting firm, and completely untouched by his family's corrupt syndicate. Suddenly, a small notification chimed from the computer. Teo clicked the email, his eyes quickly scanning the formal text. The room went perfectly still. Then, a slow, brilliant smile broke across his face, a look of pure, unburdened joy that Jackie had never seen on him before. It made him look years younger, entirely free of the heavy shadows he had carried through her door. "They signed it," Teo breathed, turning to look at her. "They signed the contract, Jackie. The routes are ours. It's official." Before Jackie could even speak, Teo stood up, his joy completely overriding his normally reserved nature. He reached down, caught her gently by the waist, and lifted her out of her chair, spinning her once in the small office. Jackie let out a bright, genuine laugh, her hands resting naturally on his broad shoulders as he set her back down on her feet. He didn't step back. His hands remained resting warmly on the curve of her waist, the physical distance between them practically zero. The sudden, intense proximity made the air in the tiny office feel incredibly thick. The easy celebration shifted instantly into something deeply intimate. "We did it," Teo said, his voice dropping into a low, earnest register, filled with profound gratitude. "But this is your victory, Jackie. You gave me the space to think, the local strategy to pivot, and the absolute support to try. You built this doorway for me." Jackie looked up into his eyes, her own smile softening into something incredibly tender. The space between them was vibrating with unspoken feelings. She didn't pull away from his gentle hold. Instead, she let her hands slide slightly down his chest, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing beneath his shirt. "I don't care about the logistics contract, Teo," she whispered, her voice soft but carrying a quiet intensity that pinned him in place. "I didn't do this just to help you build a business. I did it because seeing you stand tall, seeing you genuinely happy and at peace, that is the only reward I will ever need." Teo's breath caught. The pure, selfless nature of her words stripped away every last defense he had ever known. He looked down at her lips, the romantic tension between them pulsing so heavily, it felt as though gravity had shifted, entirely rooting him to the woman standing in his arms. The quiet hum of the bakery's morning routine was interrupted 2 days later by the low, heavy purr of an expensive engine. Teo was wiping down the front tables, a towel slung casually over his shoulder, when a sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb. The doors opened, and 2 older men stepped out onto the pavement. They wore immaculate, dark bespoke suits and carried themselves with the rigid, clinical posture of high-level corporate attorneys. Teo stopped wiping the table. His posture straightened instinctively, the relaxed warmth of the morning fading as the ghosts of his past walked through the front door. The lawyers stopped in the center of the shop and bowed deeply, a gesture of absolute traditional respect. One of them opened a thick leather portfolio and set a stack of crisp, formal documents on the nearest table, followed by a heavy gold fountain pen. "Mr. Kang," the lead attorney said, his tone perfectly measured. "The board has successfully removed your relatives for their financial crimes. The syndicate's assets have been unfrozen, and the executive seats are empty. The board formally requests your immediate return to Seoul to reclaim your position as CEO." Teo stared at the documents. Right there, on the table, was everything he had lost. His multi-billion-dollar empire, his power, his status, and his legacy. All he had to do was pick up the pen and sign his name, and the nightmare of his betrayal would be completely erased. He slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen. It felt cold and foreign in his hand. Then, he looked past the attorneys and toward the open kitchen. Jackie was standing by the counter. She had stopped dusting the pastries with powdered sugar and was watching the scene unfold. She didn't look angry, and she didn't look afraid. She just looked at him with that same calm, steady grace she had shown him since the night he arrived in the rain. She wasn't going to beg him to stay. She respected him enough to let him make his own choice. Teo looked back at the contract. If he signed it, he would go back to a glass tower. He would go back to looking over his shoulder, managing traders, and sleeping with one eye open. He would have all the money in the world, but his life would be completely empty. He looked at Jackie again. In her, he had found genuine laughter, quiet mornings, absolute loyalty, and a love that required no transaction. With a calm, steady exhale, Teo placed the gold pen back down on top of the unsigned papers. "Take these back to the board," Teo said, his voice entirely devoid of hesitation. "Tell them my resignation is permanent." The attorneys looked stunned, exchanging a confused glance. "Mr. Kang, with all due respect, you are turning away from an empire. You would be walking away from everything." "You are mistaken," Teo replied softly, a genuine, peaceful smile touching the corners of his mouth as he looked over at Jackie. "I am not walking away from anything. I have already found my true home, and it is worth more than anything you have in that briefcase. Please leave." Knowing better than to argue with a man whose mind was completely made up, The lawyers bowed respectfully, gathered their papers, and walked out the door. As the luxury car drove away, Teo walked across the bakery floor, stepping into the kitchen. Jackie met him halfway, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and he pulled her into a deep, unwavering embrace, finally completely free of the shadows he had left behind. A few weeks after the lawyers left, the autumn air turned crisp, painting the neighborhood in brilliant shades of gold and amber. Teo and Jackie took a rare evening off from the growing logistics business and the bakery, walking hand in hand down a quiet, tree-lined path in the local park. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, glowing light through the canopy above them. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, cautious quiet of two strangers. It was the deeply comfortable, peaceful stillness of two people who completely understood one another. Teo gently squeezed her hand and stopped walking. Jackie turned to face him, the evening breeze softly catching her braids. Teo looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with an intensity and a warmth that took her breath away. He reached up, gently cupping her cheek, his thumb lightly brushing across her soft skin. "When I first stood on your porch in the rain, I was a dead man walking," Teo said, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with profound emotion. "I had no family, no empire, and no future. The people who betrayed me thought they had completely destroyed the Korean Mafia Billionaire." He stepped a fraction closer, his gaze completely locked onto hers. "But they were wrong, because losing that cold, empty world was the exact price I had to pay to find you. You didn't just give me a sanctuary, Jackie. You looked at a broken man who had nothing left to offer, and you gave him grace. You healed my deepest scars, and you saved my soul." Slowly, deliberately, the powerful man sank down onto one knee onto the fallen leaves. Jackie gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth as tears immediately welled in her eyes. Teo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a beautifully simple, classic rose gold band, elegant, grounded, and perfect for the woman who worked with her hands and built a life from scratch. "I don't have a glass tower or an underworld empire to give you anymore," Teo said, looking up at her with absolute, unwavering devotion. "But I give you my whole heart, my absolute loyalty, and my life for the rest of my days. You are my true kingdom, Jackie. Will you do me the honor of marrying me?" A single tear spilled over Jackie's cheek, catching the amber light of the sunset. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees right there on the path, meeting him eye to eye, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered fiercely against his shoulder, her voice thick with pure, overwhelming joy. "Yes, Teo." He wrapped his strong arms completely around her, holding her tightly against his chest right there in the leaves, finally and permanently anchoring his life to the woman who had given him a reason to live it. A year later, the small, quiet space behind the bakery had transformed into a vibrant, sunlit courtyard. The logistics consulting firm they built together was thriving, operating smoothly out of the newly renovated office next door. But today, all business was set aside. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and the backyard was filled with the easy, joyful sound of music, laughter, and clinking glasses. Teo stood by the outdoor grill, wearing a simple, breathable linen shirt and comfortable jeans. He was expertly turning skewers of marinated vegetables and meat, deeply engaged in a warm, teasing debate with Jackie's older brother about the best local sports teams. There was no trace of the rigid, hyper-vigilant billionaire who had once commanded a frozen, lonely empire. His shoulders were completely relaxed, his eyes were bright, and his laughter came easily. He wasn't just accepted by Jackie's family, he was completely woven into it. Jackie stepped out of the bakery's back screen door, carrying a large tray of fresh, sweet pastries. She set them on the long wooden picnic table, her wedding band catching the bright afternoon sunlight. She took a moment to just stand there, watching her husband. He was surrounded by people who loved him for exactly who he was, not for what his bank account held or the power his name wielded. She walked up behind him and wrapped her arms naturally around his waist, resting her cheek against his warm back. Teo immediately stopped what he was doing. He turned around, pulling her directly into his arms and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. He didn't care who was watching. His affection for her was absolute and completely undeniable. "You look happy," Jackie murmured, smiling up at him. "I am exactly where I belong," Teo replied softly, his hands resting comfortably on her waist. He looked around the sunny, crowded yard and then back down into the eyes of the woman who had saved him. They weren't looking down at the world from a cold, isolated corporate tower anymore. They were standing firmly on the ground, completely united as equals, standing in the warmth of the beautiful, genuine sanctuary they had built together. Thank you for walking this journey with us today. If this story touched your heart, please show some love by hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, and tapping the notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell me what was your favorite moment of this story. Until next time, my beautiful family, remember the golden rule of our empire. Because in Annie's empire of love, love is the fiercest weapon we have and the only law worth breaking. Stay blessed, stay loved, and I will see you tomorrow in the next story.